The knock came just as the last light of November died behind the mountains, and Nathan Thatcher had not heard another human being's voice in 11 months. He had been sitting in the particular kind of silence that only a man who has chosen solitude can truly understand, the kind that wraps itself around you like a second skin until you almost forget it is there. The fire was low in the hearth, casting orange ribbons across the rough-hewn floorboards, and he had been staring into it the way a man stares when he is not really looking at anything at all, just letting the hours pass like water through a cupped hand. His coffee had gone cold on the table beside him. His Bible sat open on his knee, though he had not read a single word of it in the past half hour. Outside, the wind was doing what Wyoming wind does in November, which is to say it was furious and relentless and absolutely indifferent to any living creature caught in its path. He had not even been sure at first that the knock was real. 3 winters alone will do something to a man's ears, make him hear things that are not there. A creak in the pine logs becomes a voice. The scrape of a branch against the window becomes a footstep on the porch. Nathan had learned to distrust these sounds, to let them pass through him the way a stone lets water pass, unchanged and unmoved. So when the knock came, 3 sharp raps, deliberate and insistent, he sat very still for a moment and waited to see if it would happen again. It did. He set his Bible on the table beside the cold coffee and rose from the chair, his knees protesting the way they always did these days. He was 31 years old in the year of our Lord 1883, which is to say he was not old in any conventional sense of the word, but 3 winters of solitude and hard physical labor had put years on him that the calendar had not. He crossed the room and lifted the heavy iron latch, and when he pulled open the door, the wind came in first, carrying with it a scattering of hard snow and the smell of cold that has no bottom to it. Behind the wind came Adelaide Hale. She was standing on his porch with her arms wrapped around herself and her dark hair plastered wet against her face, and she was wearing a coat that had not been adequate for this weather even before the storm had had its way with it. She was shaking so hard he could see it even in the dim light spilling out from behind him, and her lips had taken on the bluish color that told him she had been out in this for too long already. She was carrying a carpet-bag that looked nearly as exhausted as she did, its leather strap clutched in both hands like it was the only certain thing left in her world. She looked at him with eyes that were dark and steady and terrified all at once, which struck him as a remarkable combination, and she said, in a voice that was trying very hard not to shake along with everything else, "I have nowhere else to go." Nathan Thatcher stood in his doorway and stared at her for a moment that probably felt much longer to her than it did to him, because he was a man who had to think things through before he acted, which was either a virtue or a flaw depending on who you asked and what the situation was. Then he stepped aside and gestured into the warmth behind him without a word, because some things do not require words, and a half-frozen woman on your doorstep in a Wyoming November is one of them. She crossed the threshold on unsteady feet, and he closed the door against the storm. He did not ask questions right away. He put her by the fire and threw 2 more logs on it and went to the kitchen corner of the cabin to heat water for coffee, and he found a wool blanket that had been folded on the chest at the foot of his bed and brought it to her without ceremony. She took it with hands that were white and stiff with cold, and she wrapped it around herself and sat in his chair by the fire, which was the better of his 2 chairs, and she stared into the flames the way he had been doing before she arrived. He watched her from the kitchen corner while the water heated. She was, he estimated, somewhere in her middle to late 20s. Her face was angular and fine-boned, and even in its current state pale and wet and tightly drawn with the effort of holding herself together. It was a face that held its ground. There was something in the set of her jaw that suggested she had not made the decision to knock on a stranger's door lightly. There was something in her eyes, when she raised them briefly to look around the cabin, that was cataloging and assessing, not helpless but calculating, the way a person looks when they are still trying to figure out how to survive whatever it is they are surviving. He poured the coffee when it was ready and brought it to her in his second-best tin cup, and she wrapped both hands around it and lifted it to her lips immediately, and he watched some of the terrible rigidity begin to leave her shoulders. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steadier now. "There's hardtack in that tin on the table," he said, "and I've got salt pork I can heat if you need something more." She looked at the tin and then back at him. "Salt pork would be welcome. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." He went back to the kitchen corner without comment and began heating the pork, and for a few minutes the only sounds were the fire and the wind and the sizzle of the iron pan. He found the end of a loaf of bread he had baked 2 days prior dense and plain, the way a man bakes bread when he is cooking only for himself, and has long since stopped caring about refinements, and cut several thick slices. When he brought the food to her, she ate with the controlled urgency of someone who is very hungry but determined not to show it, which told him that wherever she had come from and whatever had happened there, her pride had survived the journey intact. He sat down in the other chair, the one that creaked on the left side if you shifted your weight wrong, and he waited. "My name is Adelaide Hale," she said at last, when the plate was mostly empty and the coffee had brought the color back into her face. "I was heading to Laramie. The stage road passes about 4 miles east of here, I think. The driver told me this ranch was the closest shelter if anything went wrong. You were on the stage. I was supposed to be. The stage broke an axle about 7 miles back. The driver stayed with the horses and the other passengers. There were 2 men going to Laramie on business. He said they'd manage until morning when someone from town would likely come looking. But I couldn't stay out in the open like that. The cold was coming on fast and I didn't trust that I'd last until morning." She paused. "So I walked." Nathan considered the distance she had covered in the dark in this weather alone. 7 miles, he said. 4 miles of it when the storm had already come on proper, she said, which was as close as she came to acknowledging what that had cost her. "You were lucky," he said, "to know which direction to walk." "I had the driver's directions and I've always had a fair sense of direction," she said, and there was a small, tired quality to the way she said it, as if she were recounting something that had happened to someone else. "I saw your light about a mile out and I just kept moving toward it." He nodded. He looked at the window where the storm was pressing its face against the glass. "You can stay," he said. "The loft has a bedroll and it's warm enough up there with the fire going below. In the morning we'll figure out how to get you to Laramie." She looked at him with those dark eyes and he could see her reading him the way a person reads a document they are about to sign, looking for the fine print, looking for what was being promised and what was being withheld. Whatever she found in his face seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and said, "I'm grateful to you, Mr. Thatcher," he said. "Nathan Thatcher. I'm grateful to you, Mr. Thatcher. You don't need to keep saying it," he said, not unkindly. "Get warm and get some sleep. Laramie will still be there tomorrow." He gave her the loft and he slept in his own bed below, and the storm did not let up until mid-morning of the following day. Nathan was awake before dawn, the way he always was, because the ranch did not pause for storms or solitude or half-frozen women appearing at doorways. He had 12 head of cattle that needed tending, 2 horses that needed feeding, and a section of fence on the north pasture that had been worrying him since October. He dressed quietly and slipped outside into the gray pre-dawn light, and the wind had died in the night, but the snow was still falling, soft and deliberate now instead of furious, laying itself down over everything in thick white silence. He was at the barn when he heard the cabin door open behind him. He turned to see Adelaide Hale picking her way across the snow toward him, wearing the same inadequate coat but with the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders over it, and a determination in her stride that suggested she had made some internal decision about how this morning was going to go. "I can help," she said when she reached him. He looked at her for a moment. "You know cattle." "I grew up on a horse ranch in Kansas," she said. "I can muck a stall and throw hay and do whatever needs doing, I'm not going to sit inside while you work." He thought about arguing with her and then decided it was not worth the energy. He handed her the pitchfork and showed her where the hay was stored, and she set to work with a competence that was immediately obvious and somewhat startling, moving through the barn with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times before and knew where everything was by instinct, even in a barn she had never entered until 30 seconds ago. They worked together for 2 hours in the companionable silence of people doing shared labor, and Nathan found himself stealing glances at her when he was sure she was not looking. There was something that happened when he watched her work, some quiet, unfamiliar warmth that he had not felt in a long time, and that he was not entirely sure what to do with. He put it aside and kept working. When they came back into the cabin for coffee, the snow had stopped and the sky was beginning to clear from the west, and Adelaide Hale sat across from him at the table and wrapped her hands around her cup and said, "May I ask you something, Mr. Thatcher?" "Go ahead," he said. "You live out here alone." "I do." She looked around the cabin, which was a single large room plus the loft, and which bore all the marks of a man who had stopped trying to make it look like anything more than what it was: functional, spare, and slightly dusty around the edges. There were no curtains on the windows. There was no rug on the floor. The shelves along the east wall held provisions, tools, and a row of perhaps 15 books, which she had clearly noticed because her eyes had gone to them twice already. "How long?" she asked. He thought about it. "Going on 4 years now," he said. "Bought the land in the summer of '79. Spent the first few months building the cabin and the barn. Been running cattle since '80. You don't have any help." "Had a hand for about a year," he said. "Young fellow from Nebraska. He left to go to California." He paused. "I manage." She looked at him with that direct, assessing gaze that he was already beginning to recognize as characteristic of her, and she said, "And you don't mind it, the solitude." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post he could see through the window and sat there looking at nothing in particular. "I made peace with it," he said, which was true as far as it went. She accepted this answer and did not push further, which he also found he appreciated. She had a quality of knowing when to let something rest that was rarer than most people understood. They spent the morning waiting for the snow to settle enough that he could take her to Laramie in the wagon, and somewhere in that morning they began to talk in earnest. He learned that she had been born and raised in Dodge City, Kansas, which in the mid-1870s had been one of the most genuinely wild towns on the frontier, and that she had come west because there was nothing left for her in Kansas, which she said without self-pity, but with a weight that suggested there was a great deal more to the story. He did not ask. He had learned, in his years of solitude, to be patient with other people's stories the way he was patient with the land. She learned that he had come from Missouri, that he had served 2 years riding trail from Texas, before he had decided that belonging somewhere mattered more to him than the freedom of never stopping, and that he had spent 3 months looking at land before he found this particular stretch of Wyoming Valley and knew, without being able to fully explain it, that he was done looking. "My father always said that the land tells you when it wants you," Adelaide said, and something in her voice shifted when she said it, the way a person's voice shifts when they are quoting someone who is no longer living. "Your father's gone?" Nathan asked. 2 years ago," she said. "My mother before that. And then my brother went to Colorado and got into the kind of trouble that men go to Colorado to find, and I haven't had word of him since spring." She said all of this with remarkable steadiness, and then she picked up her coffee cup and looked into it, and for a moment her steadiness wobbled just slightly, like a candle flame in a draft. "So yes. I was heading to Laramie because a woman I knew from Dodge City wrote to tell me she runs a boarding house there and could use the help. It seemed like a reasonable next step." "It does," he said. She looked up from her cup. "Does it seem to you like I'm running away?" The question surprised him, both its directness and the fact that she was asking him specifically, a man she had met less than 14 hours ago. He thought about it carefully because it deserved a careful answer. "It seems to me," he said, like a person who has lost most of what they had and is trying to find something new to hold on to. That's not running away, that's just living. She looked at him for a long moment after he said that, and he had the odd sensation of being more thoroughly seen than he was accustomed to. That's a generous way to look at it, she said. Might be the accurate one, he said. After lunch, he hitched the horse to the wagon and loaded her carpetbag into the back, and they drove the road to Laramie through a world that was white and clean and absolutely silent, the way Wyoming becomes after a snow, as if the whole landscape has exhaled. Adelaide sat beside him on the wagon seat with the wool blanket across her lap, and they talked for most of the 4 hours it took to reach town, not about anything momentous, but about the things that are the texture of daily life. The way the cold affects different animals differently, the best method for putting up preserves when you have only a small stove, which of the constellations she could name, and which ones she could not, the particular quality of prairie light in early spring. He could not remember the last time he had talked this much. He found that he did not want to stop. Laramie appeared ahead of them in the late afternoon light, its wooden buildings and muddy streets and churning activity looking almost comically busy after the pure silence of the valley. Nathan drew the wagon up outside the address Adelaide had memorized from her friend's letter, and it was a solid-looking establishment on the north end of town, the kind of boarding house that aimed for respectability and mostly achieved it. Adelaide climbed down from the wagon with her carpetbag and then stood looking up at him, and there was a quality to the moment that he felt in his chest, which was unexpected and a little disconcerting. "I owe you considerably, Mr. Thatcher," she said. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I do," she said, with a firmness that told him she was not going to let this point go. "You gave me shelter and food and warmth, and you drove me to town. That is not a small thing." He looked at her in the late afternoon light, which was doing something golden and extraordinary to the world, and he said, because it was true and he saw no reason not to say it, "I was glad of the company." Something changed in her face when he said that, something small and warm and genuine. "As was I," she said, "truly." He waited until she had gone inside and the door had closed behind her before he clicked his tongue and turned the horse toward home, and he drove back through the dusk thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. He told himself he would not think about her again. He was a practical man, and he understood that the world was full of people passing through, and that the particular quality of a conversation, no matter how good it was, did not constitute a claim on any man's future. He had his land and his cattle and his books and his fire, and he had made peace with his solitude, just as he had told her. He thought about her every day for the next 2 weeks. He thought about the way she had worked in the barn as if she knew exactly what she was doing, which she had. He thought about the set of her jaw when she was determined, and the way her voice had wobbled just slightly when she spoke of her father. He thought about what she had said, "That's not running away, that's just living," which had been the most perceptive thing anyone had said to him in years. He thought about the 4 hours in the wagon when they had talked without stopping, and how alive he had felt during those hours, and how the silence of the cabin had seemed different when he returned to it. Not peaceful, the way it had always seemed before, just empty. He rode into Laramie on a Tuesday in the second week of December, which he told himself was purely a practical matter, because he needed provisions, and his sugar supply was running critically low. He purchased the sugar and the flour and the lamp oil and the other things on his list, and then he stood in the street beside his horse and thought for a long moment about whether he was going to do what he was about to do. He walked to the boarding house on the north end of town. Adelaide answered the door herself. She was wearing a plain blue dress and her hair was pinned up, and she looked more settled than she had on his porch, but something about the way her face changed when she saw him, a small involuntary softening around the eyes, told him that the settling had been more external than internal. "Mr. Thatcher," she said. "I was in town for provisions," he said, because this was true. "I thought I'd stop and see that you arrived without further difficulty." She studied him for a moment with those direct dark eyes and then stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold," she said. The boarding house had a small sitting room that Adelaide had apparently claimed as something of a personal territory, because it had books on the side table and a piece of sewing on the chair, and it smelled faintly of the particular kind of order that a capable woman imposes on a space. She poured him coffee from a pot that was already made, the way his mother used to always have a pot ready in case of visitors, and they sat across from each other, and the conversation picked up exactly where it had left off in the wagon, as naturally as breathing. He stayed for 2 hours. He was back on the road before dark because the December nights came fast and cold, but the ride home felt different from the ride 2 weeks ago. The silence felt more provisional somehow, more like a pause between things rather than an end state. He came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. By the 4th Tuesday, Adelaide was ready for him. She had a pot of coffee made and a plate of molasses cookies that she had baked that morning, which he ate 3 of before he caught himself and stopped, and she smiled at him across the table with a quality of amusement that she did not bother to hide. He found he did not mind being smiled at by her. Quite the contrary. "I've been helping Mrs. Patterson with the accounts," Adelaide told him that day. Mrs. Patterson was the woman from Dodge City who ran the boarding house. "She's a good woman, but the ledgers are a mess. I have a head for numbers. My father used to have me keep the ranch accounts." "You're good with land," he said, "and animals and numbers." "My father believed women should know how to manage what they had," she said, "whatever form it took. He was ahead of his time in that regard." The small wobble in her voice was there again, and this time he noticed that she pressed her lips together briefly afterward, as if pressing it back down. "He sounds like he was a remarkable man," Nathan said. "He was difficult and stubborn and absolutely certain he was right about everything," Adelaide said, and then she smiled, and it was a real smile, full and unguarded, the first one he had seen from her, and it rearranged his entire chest. "Which is perhaps why I have inherited those same qualities." "I hadn't noticed," he said, straight-faced. She laughed, which was also a first, and it was a good laugh, clear and genuine, the kind of laugh that makes a room feel larger than it is. Nathan picked up his coffee cup and looked at the contents and thought, with the quiet certainty of a man who knows his own mind even when it is moving in directions he had not anticipated, that he was in considerable trouble. He came back every Tuesday through December and into January, through some of the worst cold that Wyoming could manufacture, and not once did the road stop him. He told himself each time that he was coming for the coffee and the conversation, which was partially true. He told himself it was simply good to have human contact after weeks of solitude, which was also partially true. What he did not tell himself at first was the larger and simpler truth underneath all the partial ones, which was that he was coming because of Adelaide Hale and for no other reason. She was 27 years old, she told him in January, when the subject of ages came up naturally in the course of a conversation about the year. He was 31. She had been born in Kansas in 1856. He had been born in Missouri in 1852. He had 4 years on her, which was nothing remarkable. What was remarkable was what happened on a Tuesday in the middle of January when he arrived to find her in a state that was clearly, although she was managing it with her usual determined composure, one of upset. Her eyes were slightly red. The coffee was not made. She answered the door with her hands clasped in front of her and her chin lifted, which he had come to understand was what she did when she was refusing to let something knock her down. "I've had a letter from Colorado," she said as soon as he was inside. "About my brother." He sat down across from her and waited. "He died in September," she said, in a voice that was made of pure controlled will. "A mining accident outside Denver. A man he worked with wrote to our last known address in Kansas, and the letter was forwarded here by a neighbor." She unclasped her hands and looked at them, and then clasped them again. "I am the last of my family." Nathan sat with that for a moment because it deserved to be sat with and not immediately papered over with words. He had lost people too. He understood that the worst thing you can do for grief is rush it. "I'm sorry," he said simply. She nodded. She looked at the window for a moment and then back at him, and her eyes were very bright and very steady. "He was younger than me by 4 years. He was not particularly wise, my brother, but he was—" She stopped. Started again. "He was kind. He had a way of making people feel welcome that I never quite managed." "You managed it with me," Nathan said, which was not something he had planned to say, but it was true. She looked at him. "Did I?" "Every Tuesday," he said. "I drive 4 hours round trip in winter weather. That speaks to the welcome." Something happened in her face. It was not quite a smile, and it was not quite tears, and it was more moving than either. "Nathan," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice struck him as the most natural and significant thing in the world. "Why do you come?" He held her gaze. He was a man who did not speak carelessly or quickly, but he was also a man who, when he had something true to say, said it. "Because I think about you every day of the week I'm not here," he said. "And the days I am here are better than the ones I'm not." The room was very quiet. Outside, the January wind moved across the roof of the boarding house. "I think about you too," she said, which was also not said carelessly or quickly, and meant all the more for that. He reached across the table and covered her clasped hands with one of his, which was a large, rough, work-hardened hand, and hers were slim and also work-hardened in their own way, and they sat like that for a while without saying anything else, which was its own kind of conversation. He made the coffee himself, because she had forgotten about it, and they drank it by the window and watched the January cold lay itself across the town of Laramie, and he told her about his brother who had died of fever in 1875 in Missouri, the last family member he had watched go, and about how the going west had been at least partly about putting new geography between himself and all that grief. She listened the way she listened to everything, which was with her full attention and without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "I understand that, completely," and he knew she did. He did not want to leave when it was time to leave. He made himself go anyway, because a man's livestock do not care about the state of his heart, and because whatever was happening between them was happening at its own pace and he did not want to crowd it. He said good evening at the door and she said good evening back, and just before he turned to go she put her hand briefly on his arm, just for a moment, just her fingers on his coat sleeve, and said, "Come back next Tuesday." "I will," he said, and he did. February arrived with a thaw that lasted 10 days and made the road between the ranch and Laramie into a river of mud, which did not stop Nathan from making the trip. He arrived one Tuesday looking considerably worse for the journey, spattered with mud, and with one of his boots soaked through from where the horse had stepped in a deep puddle. He had not been able to steer around. Adelaide took one look at him and said, with the particular firmness that was one of her primary qualities, "Take off your boots by the door and sit down." He did as he was told without argument, which was also one of his primary qualities, and she brought him dry socks from somewhere. He did not ask where she had acquired them, and a cloth to clean up the worst of the mud, and she made him coffee and sat across from him with a light in her eyes that he was increasingly certain was there specifically for him. "I want to show you something," she said, and she went to the small writing desk in the corner of the sitting room and came back with a folded piece of paper. She spread it on the table between them. It was a letter, written in a neat but clearly unpracticed hand, from a man named Gideon Cross, who turned out to be the attorney in Laramie who handled property matters. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned that he was looking for a particular piece of land east of Laramie," Adelaide said. "We got to talking and it turns out he needs someone to help manage his office correspondence and records. He's offered me a position." Nathan looked at the letter. "That's good news," he said, which was true. "It means I'll be staying in Laramie," she said, "indefinitely." He looked up from the letter and at her face, and she was looking back at him with those dark eyes that missed very little, and he could see that she was not just telling him about the position. She was telling him something else, something that had everything to do with why a Tuesday visit mattered and what indefinitely meant in the context of it. He took a long breath and said, "Adelaide." "Yes," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you would allow it." She held his gaze for a moment that stretched out like a long afternoon. Then she said, "I would allow it. I have been waiting for you to say so for approximately 3 weeks." He laughed, which was something he had not done often enough recently, and the laugh came from somewhere real and deep, and she laughed with him, and the February thaw seemed to extend indoors, right there in the sitting room of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always does, reluctantly and then all at once. The mud road between the ranch and Laramie dried out, and Nathan was able to make the Tuesday trips without incident. And then he started coming on Saturdays as well, because Tuesday and Saturday seemed more appropriate for courting than Tuesday alone, and also because he missed her on the days between. He brought her things, sometimes, that seemed to speak without requiring words. A small bunch of early wildflowers he had found coming up along the creek bank in April. A book of poetry he had ordered from the catalog in town, because she had mentioned once briefly that she had loved poetry as a girl. A jar of honey from a wild hive he had found in the south corner of his land, because she had mentioned that she had not had good honey in years. She received all of these things in the way she received most things, with a warmth that she let show more freely now than she had in November, and she gave him things in return. She mended his second-best coat during one of his visits, which he had brought because it was coming apart at one sleeve, and she did it so neatly that the repair was nearly invisible. She wrote out a recipe for apple preserves that he had mentioned he'd been trying to reproduce from memory, his mother's recipe, and she had gotten it almost exactly right from his imprecise description, which struck him as a kind of miracle. She read to him from the book of poetry on a Saturday afternoon in April when the window was open and the breeze was coming in, and her voice doing poetry was a sound he thought he could listen to for the rest of his life. He told her about the ranch in more detail as the weeks went on, the 12 head of cattle, and the hope of building it to twice that by fall, the fence project on the north pasture that he had finally finished in March, the particular quality of the land at dawn when the mist was on the creek and the mountains were blue behind it. She listened and asked good questions, practical ones that showed she understood exactly what he was describing, and sometimes she made suggestions that he found himself actually implementing, which was not something he had expected, and which he found he valued more than he could easily say. She told him more about her life in Kansas, about the horse ranch and her father's particular methods, and the way the community of Dodge City had been in the early 70s when the cattle drives were at their height, and the town was genuinely, fabulously dangerous. She told it without drama or embellishment, the way someone tells a story that is simply their life and not a performance of it. She told him about her brief engagement at 22 to a young man who had gone east to study medicine and had decided, somewhere in the going, that he had moved on from things Western, including her. She said it without bitterness, which told him she had done the real work of getting over it a long time ago. He told her he was glad the man had been a fool. She looked at him with those eyes and said, "Are you?" "Very much so," he said, and he held her gaze and she held his, and neither of them looked away. He asked her to walk out with him on a Sunday in May, which was the last Sunday before he intended to ask her the larger and more permanent question, because he wanted to ask her properly, and he wanted to have worked out in his own mind first what he was offering, and whether it was something that was fair to offer. She put on her good hat, the one with the small dark ribbons, and they walked the length of the main street of Laramie in the Sunday afternoon light, which was warm and golden in the way of May, and people they passed nodded and tipped their hats, because Laramie was a town where people noticed things, and they had been noticing Nathan Thatcher's Tuesday and Saturday appearances for some time now. "People are watching," Adelaide said, with the particular amusement of a woman who is not particularly bothered by being watched. Let them, Nathan said. She glanced at him sidelong. That's very decisive of you. I've been decisive for a while, he said. I've just been working up to saying so. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice had that careful quality, the one that meant she was choosing her words. Nathan, what is it you're working up to? He stopped walking. They were at the edge of the town, where the wooden sidewalk ended and the prairie began, and the mountains were visible to the west, and the afternoon light was doing the extraordinary things it does in Wyoming in May, making everything look both new and ancient at the same time. He turned to face her. He had not prepared a speech. He was not a speech-making sort of man. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said, and what he said was, Adelaide, I have spent 4 years building something on that land, and all of it has been building towards something that needed one more piece. I did not know what that piece was until November, when you knocked on my door in the middle of a snowstorm. He paused. I would like you to marry me. I would like you to come and see the ranch and decide whether it's something you could make into a home. I know it is not much, as things currently stand, but I am a man who intends to build, and I would like to build it with you. She looked at him for a long time. The prairie wind moved through the grass around them with that low, oceanic sound that the Wyoming grass makes in wind, and a hawk was doing long, slow circles overhead, and the whole world seemed to be holding itself very still. I have something to tell you, she said. All right, he said. When I came to your door in November, she said, I had nowhere else to go. That was completely true. But when I knocked, I was more frightened than I have ever been in my life. Not of the storm, of asking, of needing. She stopped, started again. I have spent most of my life learning not to need things. My father was a good man, but he was not one for sentiment, and my mother died when I was 15, and I learned very young that the safest thing is to be capable, to not require anything you cannot provide for yourself. She looked at him directly. And then I met you, and every Tuesday I found myself counting the days between Saturdays, and every Saturday I found myself not wanting you to go. She took a breath. Yes, I will marry you. I have wanted to say so since February, and I have been very patient. He took both her hands in his and he kissed her, right there at the edge of the town where anyone could see, which was not the kind of thing he typically did, being a private man, but which felt, under the circumstances, absolutely necessary and completely right. She kissed him back, which was also absolutely necessary and completely right. They were married in June of 1883 in the small Presbyterian church on the east end of Laramie, which was a modest ceremony by any standard, attended by Mrs. Patterson and a few of the town people who had come to know them over the preceding months, and by a former ranch hand named Cowboy who had worked with Nathan briefly in '81, and who had heard about the wedding from someone in town and ridden 40 miles to attend because, as he told Nathan afterward with a slightly drunk sincerity, he had always thought the man worked too hard and deserved something good. Adelaide wore a dress she had made herself, which was the color of deep cream, and she had her dark hair pinned up with 2 small pearl-headed pins that had belonged to her mother. Nathan wore his good suit, which he had taken to the seamstress in town the week prior to have the jacket properly fitted, and when he saw her coming toward him down the aisle of that small church in the June light, his throat closed up in a way that required several determined swallows to manage. She stood beside him and looked up at him with those dark eyes, clear and sure and warm, and the minister said the words, and they said their own words back, and when the ceremony was over and he kissed her properly in front of what witnesses there were, Calloway made a noise of approval that was somewhat louder than the occasion strictly called for, and someone laughed, and the sunlight came through the church's 2 small windows and laid itself across the floor in long bright stripes. They drove back to the ranch that afternoon, Adelaide in the wagon seat beside him with her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, her carpet bag in the back, alongside the trunk of things she had accumulated during her months at the boarding house. The valley opened out ahead of them as they came over the last rise, and it was doing exactly what he had described to her. The creek mist long since gone in the June afternoon, but the mountains clear and brilliant in the west, and the grass green and deep after the spring rains. "Oh," she said quietly when she saw it. "Yes," he said. They sat still in the wagon for a moment and looked at it together, this particular piece of the world that was now theirs, and then he clicked his tongue and the horse moved forward. And Adelaide Hale, Adelaide Thatcher now, though it would take her a few days to fully settle into the sound of it, came home. The first weeks were full of the particular negotiation of two people learning to share a space that has been shaped entirely by one of them. Nathan had lived in the cabin for 4 years, and everything in it was in the place where he had put it, and he had stopped noticing that it was there. And Adelaide's arriving meant looking at it all with new eyes, his own eyes, reflected in hers. She did not try to change everything at once, which he appreciated. She was practical and incremental about it, asking before she moved things, explaining what she thought would work better and why. He found that he agreed with her more often than not, and on the occasions when he did not, they negotiated, and the negotiations were never unpleasant because she was not a woman who argued for the sake of arguing, only for the sake of what was actually better. She made curtains for the windows from a bolt of blue calico she had bought in Laramie, and the curtains changed the quality of the cabin's light in a way that was surprisingly significant, making it warmer in the mornings and softer in the evenings. She planted a kitchen garden in the cleared ground behind the cabin, a skill she had evidently been waiting to exercise, and by July it was producing beans and squash and the beginnings of something ambitious in the way of tomatoes. She organized the shelves along the east wall with a systematic thoroughness that meant he could find things in half the time it used to take him, and she added her own books to his, and the row of books became a substantial library for a Wyoming ranch cabin, which pleased him in a way he found difficult to articulate but did not try to hide. She worked alongside him on the ranch without any suggestion that the outdoor work was his and the indoor work was hers, because she had not been raised with those divisions, and she was not about to start honoring them now. She had strong opinions about the cattle, specifically about their grazing rotation, which she thought could be improved, and which he allowed her to redesign, and which did in fact improve. And she could read the weather in the mountains better than he could, which she attributed to growing up on the flat Kansas land where weather was visible from much further away, and you learned to pay attention to it. He listened to her predictions and found them reliable, and then found himself listening as a matter of habit. In August, a rider came from town with news that one of Nathan's cattle had been found on neighboring land, which put him into a 2-day negotiation with his neighbor, a man named Harker who ran a larger spread to the north, and who had a reputation for taking advantage of smaller operations when he could. Adelaide accompanied Nathan to this meeting without being asked, which surprised Harker considerably and surprised Nathan somewhat, though he hid it better than Harker did. She said nothing during the initial exchange, simply sat in the chair at the corner of Harker's front room and listened with complete attention. Then, when Harker made a proposal that Nathan was about to refuse on the grounds that it was not fair, she said, very calmly, "Mr. Harker, I wonder if you've considered that the fence line in question has been established incorrectly from the original survey." Mr. Thatcher filed his land claim in 1879, and the original survey puts the boundary line approximately 40 yards north of where your fence currently stands. She said this without either aggression or apology, the way someone states a verifiable fact, and she put the relevant map on the table, which she had obtained from the attorney's office the previous week, and which she had, Nathan realized, been carrying in her bag for this exact purpose. Harker looked at the map for a long time and then reached a different proposal than his first one, and they drove home having resolved the matter in their favor, and Nathan looked at her on the wagon seat beside him with an expression he could not fully control. "When did you get that map?" he said. "The day after we heard about the cattle," she said. He shook his head slowly. "Adelaide." "Yes," she said with that light in her eyes. "I would like to say," he said carefully, "that marrying you is the most strategically sound decision I have ever made." She laughed her clear, good laugh and put her hand on his arm. "You're welcome," she said. He caught her hand and held it, and they drove the rest of the way home like that. And the evening was warm and the grass was golden, and the mountains were turning purple in the west. And he thought with a conviction that went all the way to his bones that this, exactly this, precisely this was what 4 years of building had been building toward. September brought the first hints of autumn, the aspens beginning their gold at the higher elevations, and it also brought a decision Nathan had been thinking about since spring, which was the purchase of additional cattle. He wanted to bring the herd to 25 head before winter, which would require significant investment, but would position them well for the following year's market. He and Adelaide sat at the table on a September evening with the account books open between them, and she worked through the numbers with him with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. And together, they arrived at a plan that was ambitious but sound. "We'll need help by next spring," she said, looking at the numbers. "If the herd is at 25 and we're managing the expanded pasture, you cannot do it alone." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about hiring a hand." "Do it in early spring," she said, "before the work gets ahead of you." "Yes," he said. He looked at her across the lamplight. "You know, there was a time when no one told me what to do about this ranch." "How was that working for you?" she said without looking up from the ledger. He smiled and reached over and closed the ledger gently, and she looked up and he said, "Come outside with me for a minute." She came with him onto the porch, where the September night was cold and full of stars, the particular fullness of stars at that elevation and that time of year, when the sky feels near enough to touch. And he stood behind her with his arms around her, and she leaned back against him, and they looked at the mountains in the darkness, which were present more as a deeper darkness against the sky than as visible shapes. "I want you to know something," he said into her hair. "Tell me," she said. "I spent 4 winters out here," he said. "Well, almost 4, the last one we spent together." "You did," she said. "The first 3, he said, I told myself I was content. That solitude was the price of building something worth having, and that I had agreed to pay it, and I had no complaint." He paused. "That was partially true and substantially not true. I was lonely. I just didn't see any remedy for it." She turned in his arms so she could look at him. In the starlight her face was pale and clear and her eyes were very dark. "And now," she said, "now I understand that the building was always for this," he said, "for someone to share it with. For it to mean something to someone other than just me." He looked at her. "For it to mean something to you." She reached up and put her palm against his jaw, which was a gesture that she had developed somewhere in the months of being his wife, something she did when she wanted him to understand something she was about to say. "Nathan Thatcher," she said, "this land is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, and you built it. And yes, it means something to me. It means everything." He kissed her there on the porch under the September stars, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the creek was making its low sound in the darkness, and the aspens, though they could not see them, were standing in their gold in the hills above. October arrived, and with it the serious business of preparing for a Wyoming winter, which is not a casual undertaking. Nathan and Adelaide worked side by side through the month with a shared focus that had become so natural they rarely needed to discuss it. They each saw what needed doing and did it, and when the doing required coordination, they coordinated without friction. He was aware, in those weeks, of a particular quality of happiness that he had not encountered before, which was not the dramatic kind but the deep and steady kind, the kind that sits in your chest like a banked fire and is not flashy but is absolutely reliable. In late October, Adelaide told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen corner of the cabin on a Thursday morning when he had come in from the early chores for coffee, and she said it directly, in her characteristic way, watching his face while she said it. He stood very still for a moment, processing. Then he set his cup down on the table and crossed the room and took her face in both his hands and said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said, and she was smiling now, a smile he did not see often because she kept the deepest ones for private moments, a smile that had tears just behind it somewhere, not sad tears but the other kind. "Adelaide," he said, which was sometimes all he needed to say. "I know," she said. He held her for a long time there in the cabin, the October wind making its preparations outside, and he thought about the specific chain of circumstances that had led from a stormy November evening to this moment, from a knock on his door to a woman standing in his kitchen carrying his child, and the chain of it seemed both impossibly unlikely and completely inevitable, the way the best things always do when you look back at them. They rode into Laramie the following week to consult with the doctor, who confirmed what Adelaide already knew and told her she was in good health and that everything appeared to be proceeding as it should. They stopped at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house on the way back, and Mrs. Patterson received the news with such wholehearted delight that she immediately produced a bottle of something she had been saving for a significant occasion and poured small glasses for all of them, and they drank to the health of the expected Thatcher, which Mrs. Patterson kept calling the little one with an affectionate specificity that Adelaide bore with the amused patience she reserved for people she genuinely liked. November brought the first real snow, and Nathan found himself looking at it differently this year, not as the beginning of the long endurance that winter had always been, but as the first snowfall of a new chapter. He and Adelaide sat by the fire on the anniversary of the night she had knocked on his door, which they had both noticed without making a production of it, and he said, "1 year ago tonight." She looked at him across the fire. She was knitting something, her hands moving with the practiced ease of a woman who knit quickly and well, and she lowered the needles and looked at him. "I was so frightened," she said, "of knocking. I stood on your porch for nearly 5 minutes before I could bring myself to do it." "I didn't know that," he said. "You couldn't see it," she said. "By the time you opened the door, I had myself together well enough." She was quiet for a moment. "I had passed 2 other homesteads on my way from the stage, both dark, both clearly empty for the winter. I thought, if this one is dark too, I don't know what I'm going to do. And then I saw your light." He thought about the light he had never thought twice about, the fire he had kept burning through 3 winters of solitude simply because it was cold and a man needed fire, never imagining that it was also a beacon for someone he hadn't yet met. "I'm glad it was on," he said. "So am I," she said. "More than I can say." He reached over and covered her hand with his, the way he had done on the day she had told him about her brother, and she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they sat like that with the fire going and the snow coming down outside and the future arriving, slowly and certainly, on schedule. Winter was gentler than the previous ones had been, or perhaps it only seemed that way because there was someone to share it with. They read to each other in the evenings, taking turns with the books on the shelf, working their way through novels and histories and occasionally the book of poetry, which Adelaide still preferred for the evenings when the snow was quiet and the light was low. Nathan discovered that he had opinions about poetry that he had not known were there until she drew them out of him, and she argued with those opinions with a spirited thoroughness that he found entirely engaging. There was a quality to those winter evenings that he knew, even as he was living them, was something he would remember for the rest of his life. The particular light of the lamp on the walls they had built together, the smell of the fire and whatever Adelaide was cooking, her voice doing poetry or telling him something she had read, the sound of the wind outside rendered harmless by the walls between them and it. There was a wholeness to it that he had not understood was missing until she arrived, and now that it was present he could not imagine its absence. In January, a letter arrived from an attorney in Kansas informing Adelaide that a small amount of money and property had been held in trust from her father's estate, pending the settlement of a debt that had now been resolved. The amount was modest but meaningful, and she sat with the letter for a long time and then folded it and put it away with the careful deliberateness of someone setting something in its proper place. "What do you want to do with it?" Nathan asked. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "I would like to put it toward hiring the hand you need in spring, and whatever is left I would like to keep for the child." She paused. "My father would have approved of both." He nodded slowly. "Your father sounds like he would have been worth knowing. He would have liked you," she said, with the certainty of someone who knew both the person they were describing and the person they were describing them to, and who was therefore qualified to make the judgment. He had no patience for men who couldn't work and no patience for men who couldn't listen. "You're both." Nathan Thatcher had been called many things in his life, and compliments had not featured prominently among them, because the kind of life he had led was not one where compliments were the currency of exchange. He sat with hers for a moment and let it settle. "Thank you," he said, with a sincerity that he did not bother to understate. February brought a cold snap that lasted 2 weeks and required vigilance with the cattle, and Nathan and Adelaide worked through it with the practical focus of people who understand that livestock depend on them and that conditions wait for no one. She was showing now, her pregnancy visible in the changed shape of her coat, and she moved slightly differently, more careful and deliberate. But she did not slow down in any way that mattered, and he did not suggest she should, because he knew her well enough by now to understand that suggesting she take it easy would be received as something between an insult and a comedy. He did, however, do the heavier lifting without comment, and he made sure the path between the cabin and the barn was always clear of ice before she needed to walk it, and he kept the water heating every morning, so there was always something warm ready when she came in from the cold. She noticed all of this without remarking on any of it, which was how they had arrived at their domestic arrangement in general. Neither of them was one for fuss, but neither of them missed what the other did, and there was a particular satisfaction in being seen without requiring announcement. The hand they hired in March was a young man named Samuel Reeves, 20 years old and steady in the way that some young men are when they have been taught by people who took the work seriously. He came from a ranch family in Nebraska, and he knew cattle, and he asked sensible questions and did not ask foolish ones. And Adelaide liked him immediately, which Nathan took as the reliable indicator it had proven itself to be. Samuel set up in the barn's small side room that Nathan had fitted out for the purpose, and the ranch's rhythm adjusted to include him, expanding around him the way a river expands around a new stone. Samuel was present and working on the morning in early April when Adelaide's time came. Nathan had read enough and heard enough to know broadly what was expected of him, and what was expected of him was to get the doctor from Laramie with sufficient speed, which he did, riding the distance at a pace the horse did not particularly enjoy. The doctor arrived in time, and the labor was long, and Adelaide was, throughout it, the most intensely focused person Nathan had ever witnessed, which is saying something given that he had watched her face down Harker with a survey map. She was magnificent, was the word he kept arriving at as he waited, and it was not a word he used carelessly. Their son was born on a morning in April of 1884, when the world was doing its reluctant Wyoming spring, and he was a sound and healthy boy with a remarkable amount of dark hair that he had evidently inherited from his mother. And he was placed in Adelaide's arms while Nathan sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and looked at both of them with an expression that he made no attempt whatsoever to control. "Hello," Adelaide said to the baby, in a voice he had never heard her use before, soft and wondering and completely unguarded. The baby looked at her with the unfocused intensity of someone who has just arrived and is still taking inventory, and Nathan looked at them both and felt something happen in him that was too large for any word he knew but that he understood completely. "What do you want to name him?" he asked. Adelaide looked at the baby for a long moment. Then she looked at Nathan. "Robert," she said, "for my father." "Robert Thatcher," Nathan said, trying the sound of it. "Robert Henry Thatcher," Adelaide said. "Henry for yours." His father's name had been Henry. He had not told her that many times once, in passing, months ago, and the fact that she had kept it and was using it now closed something in his chest that had been open for a very long time. "Robert Henry Thatcher," he said, and the baby seemed to consider this verdict and accept it, making a small sound of either agreement or complaint. Samuel came to the door of the cabin an hour later, hat in hand, and Nathan told him through the doorway, and the young man's face broke into a grin of such unguarded pleasure that it was impossible not to return it. "Congratulations, Mr. Thatcher," Samuel said. "And Mrs. Thatcher, is she well?" "She's exceptional," Nathan said, which was not the conventional answer but was the accurate one. The spring unfolded around the new shape of their life with Robert in it. Adelaide recovered with the determined speed of someone who has decided that recovery is a project to be completed efficiently, and she was up and managing the household and portions of the ranch work within 2 weeks, which the doctor had recommended against, and which she had listened to with polite attentiveness before doing as she thought best. Robert was a good-natured baby who slept in decent intervals and regarded the world with the dark-eyed attention that would later prove to be characteristic of him, and who was passed between his parents and Samuel with an ease that suggested he was going to grow up understanding that the world was full of people who would take care of him. Nathan looked at his ranch in the evenings of that spring and saw it differently than he had ever seen it before. The 23 head of cattle moving in the pasture, the kitchen garden coming up green and organized behind the cabin, the fence on the north pasture tight and sound, the barn solid and well kept, the cabin with its blue calico curtains and its rows of books, and the sound, coming from inside, of Adelaide's voice doing something that resolved, as he pushed open the door, into a song he didn't know the words to, but that Robert, being rocked in his mother's arms, appeared to find deeply satisfactory. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him come in, watching the two of them in the lamplight, and the feeling in his chest was that banked fire feeling again, deep and steady and absolutely reliable, the kind of happiness that does not require anything dramatic because it is not dramatic. It is simply the truest thing there is. She looked up and saw him. "The door," she said. "It's cold." He closed the door and crossed the room and sat beside her, and Robert turned his head toward his father's voice with the infallible accuracy of babies who know who belongs near them. "He's been fed," Adelaide said. "He should sleep soon." "Good," Nathan said. He reached over and put one finger in Robert's small fist, which the baby gripped with the tremendous conviction of someone holding onto something important. "Good evening, Robert Henry." Robert made a sound. "I think that was agreement," Adelaide said. "I think it was," Nathan said. She leaned her head against his shoulder carefully, so as not to disturb the baby, and he put his arm around her carefully, for the same reason, and the three of them sat by the fire in the cabin that Nathan had built 4 years ago in a Wyoming valley when he had believed he was building it only for himself, and the fire was warm and the night was outside where it belonged, and the future was in the room with them, small and sound and entirely present. Summer came on, and the ranch was fully alive with it, the pastures deep green and the creek running clear, and Robert old enough by July to be carried in a sling against his mother's chest while she worked, which turned out to suit everyone involved remarkably well. Samuel had settled into the work with a quiet competence that Nathan appreciated deeply, and the three of them, four, counting Robert, operated as a unit that the ranch had never been before, responsive and effective in the way that only comes when the people working together genuinely know and trust each other. Adelaide had maintained her correspondence with Mrs. Patterson in Laramie, and Mrs. Patterson came out to visit in July and pronounced the ranch and its inhabitants to be in every way satisfactory, and she held Robert with the practiced ease of a woman who had held a great many babies and found them universally worthwhile, and she told Adelaide that she looked more herself than she had ever seemed in Laramie, which was, from Mrs. Patterson, a significant statement. What did she mean by more yourself? Nathan asked later, after Mrs. Patterson had driven back to town in the rented buggy. She means I was somewhat diminished in Laramie, Adelaide said, without defensiveness. I was managing. Managing is not the same as living. Here I'm living. She was standing at the kitchen corner stirring something that smelled of the tomatoes from her garden, and she did not look at him while she said it, but her voice had the quality it had when she was saying something that mattered, the particular clarity that meant she was not choosing her words at random. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her back, at the straightness of her spine, and the efficiency of her movements and the dark hair pinned up under her hat, and he thought, here. This is what I built the room for. Adelaide, he said. She turned. Yes. I want you to know, he said, that whatever I'm building here from now on, I'm building it with you in mind. Every decision, every plan, what's good for this ranch is what's good for both of us. She looked at him for a moment with those direct eyes, and then she set down the spoon and crossed the room to him and put both hands on his chest flat, the way she did when she was about to say something very certain. Nathan, she said, I know that. I have known it for a long time. He covered her hands with his. Outside, Robert was sleeping in his basket in the shade by the cabin door where the breeze came through, and Samuel was somewhere on the north pasture doing whatever needed doing there, and the summer was at its height, and the world was exactly what it should be. Fall came around again, the second fall of their marriage, and with the aspens at gold and the evenings cool and the first serious planning for winter underway, they rode into Laramie together one Saturday in September for provisions and banking business, and the general pleasure of being in town together occasionally, which they had fallen into the habit of doing once a month since Robert's birth. Robert rode between them on the wagon seat, which he found extremely interesting, and he spent most of the 4-hour drive examining the landscape with the focused attention of a baby who intends to understand everything. In Laramie, they went to the general store and the bank, and they stopped at the attorney's office where Adelaide had worked briefly before the wedding, and Gideon Cross received them with the warmth of a man who had followed their story with something like investment in the outcome. And he told Nathan that the ranch's standing was excellent, and that the additional land on the south side of the creek that Nathan had been considering purchasing might be a sound investment. And Adelaide asked 3 questions about the title, and the water rights that Nathan had not thought to ask, and that Cross answered with visible admiration for the specificity of the inquiry. On the way home, with the wagon full and Robert asleep in Adelaide's lap, Nathan said, "You should have been a lawyer." "Probably," she said without false modesty, "but I am better positioned as I am. Partnered to one with access to all the relevant documents," he said. "Exactly," she said, and she smiled at him sideways in the afternoon light. He bought the land on the south side of the creek in October, and it was the right decision, as things that are made together with the right person tend to be. 2 years passed in the way that good years pass when you are living in them rather than waiting for them to be over, which is quickly enough to catch you off guard, but fully enough that every day had its weight and its meaning. Robert grew from a baby who gripped Nathan's finger into a small, determined person who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's steadiness, and an opinion about everything, stated with complete confidence at all times. By the time he was 2.5, he was following Samuel around the barn with the solemn dedication of someone in formal apprenticeship, and Samuel bore this companionship with a patience and genuine affection that confirmed what Nathan and Adelaide had already known about the young man's character. In the spring of 1887, Adelaide told Nathan she was expecting again. He received this news with a warmth that was different from the first time, less stunned, more purely glad, the gladness of a man who knows exactly how much a child means because he already has one and is not operating on speculation. "It'll be close to spring," she said, looking at the calendar. "March or April, I think." "March or April is good," he said, The worst of the winter will be past. That was my thought, she said. He looked at her across the table. She was 30 years old and she had been his wife for nearly 4 years, and he looked at her now the way you look at something when you have looked at it long enough that you know it in all its conditions. In the morning light before anything has been composed, in the work-finished evening, in the full summer and the hard winter, and it has only become more what it is, more entirely itself, and the knowing of it is a pleasure that does not diminish. Adelaide, he said. What? She said with the patience of a woman who had learned that when he said her name like that, he was gathering something. Are you happy? He said. She did not answer immediately, which was not because she was uncertain, but because she was giving it the consideration it deserved. Yes, she said at last. Completely. Are you? Completely, he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, which was the same gesture he had made toward her in the boarding house on the day her brother's death had arrived in a letter, and he turned his hand over and held hers. The second pregnancy moved through the seasons alongside the ranch's rhythm, and Adelaide maintained her characteristic competence throughout it, managing the household and the books and a portion of the outdoor work through fall and into winter. And when the cold snap came in February, she and Nathan managed it together the way they managed everything, which was to say efficiently and without drama, and with a complete trust in the other person's judgment and effort. The baby arrived in late March, a girl this time, born on a morning when the snow was melting off the roof in slow drips, and the first meadowlarks were back in the grass, and the world smelled of mud and new growth. She was a solid, healthy baby with Nathan's gray eyes, which surprised everyone including Nathan, and she cried with an authority and confidence that made Adelaide smile from the first moment. What do you want to call her? Nathan asked, sitting beside Adelaide the way he had sat beside her when Robert was born, with the same fullness in his chest that had not diminished in the repetition but had, if anything, expanded. Adelaide looked at the baby for a long time. Clara, she said. My mother's name was Clara. Clara Thatcher, Nathan said. Clara Jane Thatcher, Adelaide said. Jane for yours. His mother's name had been Jane. He had told her that when? Sometime in the second winter, probably. One of those evenings by the fire when they had talked about everything and nothing, and the time had passed without them noticing. She had kept it, the way she kept everything that mattered. Robert was 3 years old and deeply interested in his new sister with the thorough and somewhat analytical interest of a small person confronted with something entirely new. He came to look at her with his dark eyes very serious and his assessment very focused, and then he declared with the finality of a verdict, "She's small." "She is," Nathan agreed. "Will she stay small?" "For a while," Nathan said. Robert considered this. "All right," he said, and accepted it. Samuel came to the door and received the news and said with a grin, "Congratulations again, Mr. and Mrs. Thatcher." And when Nathan asked him to go into town to let Mrs. Patterson know, he saddled up and went with a speed that suggested he was also glad of the excuse for the ride. Summer came again, and Clara grew and Robert grew, and Samuel, who was 23 now, had quietly established himself as a permanent feature of the ranch, which Nathan and Adelaide had discussed, and which they both considered an entirely satisfactory development. He was reliable and skilled, and he was fond of both children in a genuine and uncomplicated way, and he had become something closer to part of the household than an employee, and Nathan paid him accordingly. The south pasture that Nathan had purchased in '85 was fully operational now, and the herd had grown to 38 cattle, and Nathan had been approached twice in the past year by men wanting to buy the ranch, which told him that his land and his management of it had been noticed in the way that good work gets noticed in a community of people who understand land. Both times he had declined without particular deliberation, which had surprised one of the men enough that he said so, and Nathan had said simply, "A man who has found where he belongs doesn't have much reason to be elsewhere." He had driven home from that conversation thinking about how different that answer was from the man he had been in 1879, looking at land for 3 months before settling, uncertain what home meant or whether he would recognize it when he found it. He thought about the 3 winters of solitude and the particular quality of the silence that had accumulated in this cabin during those winters, the kind of silence that is the absence of something rather than a presence of its own. And he thought about a November night, and a knock on the door, and Adelaide Hale standing in his doorway with her carpetbag and her pride and her particular dark-eyed steadiness, saying that she had nowhere else to go. He had nowhere else to go either, he thought. He had been there for 4 years already, without knowing it. He was home when the wagon came over the last rise and the valley opened out below him, and the curtains were in the windows still blue calico, replaced now twice since Adelaide had made the first set, and smoke was rising from the chimney, and through the open barn door he could see the yellow rectangle of the lamp Samuel had lit for the early evening chores. Robert would be somewhere in the barn with Samuel, as he always was at this hour, conducting his ongoing apprenticeship with the livestock. Clara would be inside, which was where she spent her early evenings, in close proximity to her mother, with whom she had already established a bond of ferocious mutual devotion. He pulled up at the barn and handed the horse to Samuel, who appeared with Robert at his side, and Robert said, "What did he say?" with the directness of a child who had been listening to adult conversations longer than the adults always remembered. "He said no thank you," Nathan said. Robert nodded as if this was the expected answer. "Good," he said. "This is our land." Nathan looked at his son, who was 4 years old and had arrived at this conclusion apparently independently and with complete certainty. "Yes, it is," he said. He went inside, and the cabin was warm and smelled of whatever Adelaide had been cooking, and Clara was on her blanket on the floor regarding the ceiling with the intellectual interest of a 5-month-old to whom everything is equally remarkable, and Adelaide was at the stove, and she turned when he came in and said, "Close the door, it's cold," the way she always did, which would never stop being something he found quietly wonderful. He closed the door. He crossed the room. He stood behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him for a moment, the way she did when they had a moment of stillness in a day full of doing, and he bent his head and she tilted hers and he kissed her temple, and she said, "He wanted to buy it again." "He did," Nathan said, and I told him no." She made a small sound of satisfaction. "Good," she said, which was the same thing Robert had said, which he supposed was what happened when a son grew up alongside the particular certainty of his mother. She stirred whatever was in the pot, and he kept his arms around her for another moment, and looked at the cabin that was now so thoroughly their cabin that he could no longer remember very clearly what it had looked like before it was. The curtains in the windows, the books doubled on the shelves, the children's things accumulated in the corners, the kitchen organized in the way Adelaide had organized it in her first weeks, which was to say in a way that made absolute sense and that he had completely internalized. The Bible on the shelf, he read it now, as opposed to staring at it, beside the poetry book and the novels and the histories and Robert's first school books, which Adelaide had ordered from the catalog in town, and which she used on the evenings when the light was good and Robert was willing. He released her so she could manage the stove, and he went to pick up Clara, who received him with an expression of enormous pleasure and grabbed at his collar with both hands, and he carried her around the room for a while so she could see everything from this new height, which she found deeply informative. "What's for supper?" he said. "Venison stew," Adelaide said. "Samuel got a deer last week." "I've been making it last. It smells good." "It is good," she said without false modesty. Robert came in from the barn with the noise and energy that characterized all his arrivals, shedding his coat and his hat with the focused speed of a child who knows there is food coming. And Samuel came behind him and took his place at the corner of the table where he always sat. And Adelaide ladled out the stew into the bowls, and Nathan put Clara in her chair with the wooden rail that he had made in February, and they ate supper together in the warm lamplight of the cabin, the 6 of them 5. If you counted correctly, but Clara's presence was large enough to more than account for a sixth. The conversation at supper was the kind of conversation that a family has when they know each other well and are comfortable with the gaps. Robert reporting on the day's events in the barn with great specificity, Samuel contributing where prompted, Adelaide asking questions that drew out the most interesting parts of Robert's account, Nathan listening to all of it with the deep pleasure of a man for whom dinner conversation had, for 3 winters, consisted of the creak of the cabin and the wind. After supper, after the dishes and after the children were put to bed, Robert under protest, as always, and Clara with the peaceful inevitability of a small person who has decided the day is over, Nathan and Adelaide sat by the fire in the chairs that were positioned exactly as they had been on the November night she had arrived, because there is a logic to where chairs belong in relation to a fire, and some things do not need changing. He had his coffee. She had hers. The fire was doing what fire does. She said, "Do you remember what you thought of me when you first opened the door?" He considered this. "I thought you were going to fall down," he said. "And then I thought you were doing everything in your power to make sure you didn't." "I was," she said. "And I thought," he said, "that whatever had happened to bring you to my door in that storm must have cost you a great deal, and that you had paid the cost and kept going anyway." She looked at him across the fire. "Did you think I was beautiful?" She said, which was not the kind of thing she typically asked. She was not a woman who placed high importance on that particular question, and so when she asked it, he understood that she was asking something else along with it. "Yes," he said, immediately. And then it became less important than all the other things, but it was there from the beginning. She smiled. "That's exactly the right answer." "I know you," he said. "You do," she said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then she said, "I have thought many times about what would have happened if I had not knocked, if I had kept walking or turned back or found another way." "Don't," he said. "I know," she said. "I know it's foolish. But sometimes I feel the weight of it, how close it all came to not happening." He looked at her and said, with the certainty that had become the bedrock of everything he was, "You knocked. That's what happened." She raised her eyes from the fire to him. "I knocked," she said, "and I opened the door," he said, "and that was 3 winters ending and everything else beginning." She reached across the space between the chairs, the same space they had always reached across, and he took her hand, and the fire was warm and the children were asleep, and outside the Wyoming night was doing what Wyoming nights do in the autumn, cold and clear and absolute, the kind of dark that is made of thousands of miles of open country, and the sky coming all the way down to the edges of the world. He sat with his wife's hand in his, and his children asleep in the loft above him and his land stretching out in the darkness around the cabin, and the life he had built slowly, carefully, with 4 years of solitude, and then 3 more years of building it again with someone beside him, was fully assembled and fully inhabited and fully, completely real. The fire burned down and they let it, because the coals would hold through the night and the morning was always manageable, and eventually Adelaide said she was going to sleep, and she went, and Nathan sat for a few minutes more the way he used to sit alone in this chair watching the fire, except that now the sitting was different, not the passive surrender to silence but a chosen pause, a deliberate moment of taking stock. He thought, a man who has nowhere he belongs and nowhere he needs to be will go looking for both of those things whether he admits it to himself or not. He had been looking, in his way, for 4 years before she came. He had been building a place for someone he had not yet met, and he had not known that was what he was doing until she walked through the door and the place became complete. He thought, she had nowhere else to go, but she had come to the right door. She had stood in the storm and made herself knock, and he had opened it, and neither of them had ever had to go elsewhere again. He banked the fire for the night, and he climbed the stairs, proper stairs now, that he had built in the first year of their marriage to replace the ladder, because Adelaide had pointed out with her characteristic practicality that a ladder was acceptable for 1 person and inadvisable for 2. particularly when one of the two was expecting and he went to bed beside his wife in the dark. And outside the stars were doing what Wyoming stars do, which is everything. And the night was quiet and cold, and full of the kind of peace that does not require any noise to prove it is there. In the morning the meadowlarks came back. They always did, no matter how deep the winter. They came back, and the creek was running, and the cattle were moving in the pasture, and Robert was awake before anyone else, the way he always was, because he had his mother's impossible relationship with sleep, and Clara was still in her long morning contentment, and Adelaide was making coffee, and Nathan stood in the doorway of the cabin in the early light and breathed the air of his valley, which smelled of autumn and cold, and the particular cleanness of this specific stretch of Wyoming ground that he had looked at in the summer of 1879 and known, in the way you sometimes know things before you can explain them, was his. It was his. It was theirs. It was exactly enough and considerably more than he had ever, in his 3 winters of solitude, dared to want. He turned from the doorway and went inside, and the door closed behind him, and the morning got on with its business, and the life that had started with a knock in the dark continued to be built, day by day, the way good things are built, by 2 people who had found each other at the right door at the right time, and had had the wisdom and the courage to let what was possible become what was real.